I work with large government agencies, large global enterprises, small boutiques, and sorry, I'm trying to fix the noise in the background. And in many ways, I do the same thing across all sizes of organizations. The scale and objective sometimes is different. But I find it interesting how at this point in my work that I enjoy large systems because I enjoy the complexity of them. I also enjoy small systems because obviously there's things you can get done much faster. But I'm intrigued at this point in my practice and my career at the applications are the same. And that's been something I've been playing with and scrutinizing for the last 15 years. Scale is really the difference, but how you apply change doesn't really change very much. And so I'm always very interested in setting the conditions up for people to lean into doing change work in a system that says it wants to change. And I continue to sort of research and play around in that space to see what I discover about how change actually works, both from a practitioner standpoint and organizations adopting change, if you will. So I thought I'd do a check-in to see who's in the virtual room here. And I had 3 different prompts to give you all, if you'll type it in for me. Are you a practitioner or something else? I would love to know. What's a single word describing what you want to learn coming to my session and having maybe read my article? And it's a single word articulating where you're at this point in the day in these rather dynamic and challenging times. So I'm just watching you guys as you type in. See where everybody, Agile coach, Agile leader, learning about Agile and Scrum, product owner, team coach. Coach disguised as a project manager, learning perspectives, Boston, cool. All right, you guys can keep going. That gives sense. I appreciate it. It's cool. Keep going. Then everybody else can. I don't know if you guys have all done this to see who's in the room, but that's awesome. Happy to have you. So a little bit about where this article came from. When I write, just a little bit about my writing tends to sort of come out of me at funny times. I don't exactly write it myself. Something else happens and it's written out my hand. And this article came out, we had been developing a methodology for 3 years, and I was in a large organization, and I was 1 year in at that point to a 2-year, what became a 2-year project inside a large consulting company, in a function inside a large consulting company, and which was a wild environment because we were consulting to a consulting company. So you have lots of force fields with that dynamic. Although we do a very particular type of work, and we were brought in by a function head to help disrupt his function and help it move into sort of a more progressive organization, adopting ways of working that would move them into being more responsive, more agile, more nimble, more dynamic in terms of how they did their work and coordinated. And they were large, and I was working with a marketing function. So large function,
So I've lost her completely. Has anyone else?
I think she may have gotten
Oh.
disconnected. Let's see. Yes, I think we did lose her. Let me see. Oh, okay, she should jump right back in now that she's officially disconnected. We've been doing pretty good. This is the first time today we've had connection issues. Christine, all right, there you go. We'll hand it over.
Okay, great. Sorry, everybody. I'm working with the finicky internet connection apparently today. So where I left you was I was telling you the history of where the article came from in year one of a 2-year project. And in the course of that project, I would get asked a lot of questions about sort of, is this the right change work? What exactly are you all doing? Is it the same as Agile? Is it different because we're doing Agile, or I have experience in this area versus that area? And it was always so fine questions, but also it became such a, a, a large group of a large element of the background chatter of the project that I found it just interesting. And as an organization that does org transformation work, we're always up against that question that can seem like a really smart question, but behind the smart question is always this disguised resistance or workaround to actually doing change. And so after several years of being in the space and doing the work, the article about Dear Beloved Clients, Please Start by Doing came about. So just to extract from the article there's a couple different themes going through it, but 3 of the key ones that I was talking about, and I talk a lot about still in my work. 2018, it's like 100 years ago, as was February this year. So this is alive and well in my work now also. So it just happened to be then that I wrote about it. But debate inhibits progress, right? Like if we're sitting around debating which change, what type of change, if change, should we change, should we not change? And everybody talks about change all the time. Debate gets us nowhere. Debate is just about debate. Doing is progress, right? Change is all about doing. Like we cannot change and stay the same. So we have to actually do something in order to trigger, catalyze, make change actually happen. So debate is inaction. Action actually looks like doing particular things, and it's in doing those things that we get into some forward motion, and then we're in the exercise of change and we can let it show us what it's going to show us. And then the other thing in my article that I wrote about, a lot inspired by Dave Snowden's work, because he's just a go-to for me. I could name a lot of people, but ideology isn't a method. So I'm always very uncomfortable as a person who's been in the change business for a long time of anybody proselytizing or trying to anchor to anything too tightly, because it's a warning flag, right? Because change doesn't look like that. Systems don't take to that. And healthy change is never going to be fully realized if we're trying to follow a step-by-step process. So those are 3 principles that are very important to me in my practice that were threaded in that writing. Too much time and money is spent considering change versus doing change. That is a brilliant way for a lot of people to make money in organizations, and particularly large ones. And people do that, and it's frustrating. And I talk about it in sales conversations all the time, because, you know, if we're talking about change a lot, or we're teaching an ideology about change, we're not doing change, but we're spending money either way. And then it's very hard to turn that around, because we actually get somewhat attached as adults to that non-doing, because that somehow seems like it's doing something. It's a lot easier. It's a lot easier not to do change than it is to actually do change. In my work right now, in the Ready's work, we use a lot of tools and practices. We teach operating rhythms. We teach a lot of how to do things in small ways to instigate large change. And so leveraging tools, practices, and rhythms to root thinking strategically, right? We turn around the idea of thinking strategically, because we do not think about planning as a strategic tool. We think about doing as a strategic tool, and getting people into rhythms, operating rhythm, meeting rhythms, different ways of communicating that helps people think strategically. So it's the doing that then helps thinking, which is a bit counterintuitive. Leveraging tools and practices roots working dynamically and iteratively. So we anchor to just doing things, starting something, and allowing that work and the dynamic nature of being a team or a group of people thinking and doing in real time to iteratively show us what we're discovering. And then we use what we discover to do more and discover more. I know I'm preaching to the choir in a lot of ways here, so bear with me. And then learning constantly, right? So we're constantly looking at what we're doing, allowing it to inform and teach and give us insights and slivers to see through, to then push forward more behavior, more doing, to get at more change. So the continuous change process is, and living in organizations today that will never not be, and we're living in one of the most dynamic moments in time right now that illustrates all of this quite poignantly, that change is always upon us, always happening, and it's how we actually anchor in the work of the day-to-day that enables us to healthfully work in constant change, enables us to anchor in chaos when chaos erupts, enables us to be responsive and adaptive with the winds of change happening regularly. Again, commoditizing any method or practice as a whole system change ideology versus a method of intervention will quickly create limitations on the application in complex, perpetually changing ecosystems. So again, this is that hazard that I find myself up against and talking about frequently, which is, you know, we have to apply words to an intervention method, because, you know, the relation because they are binding, and people want things that are much more tangible than most true change processes enable us to execute on. So it's a bit of an interesting paradox there. But again, the commoditization of change is, and it's quite loud nowadays, it's a real hazard. And being able to facilitate people in the process of change is more of where the artistry and the mastery lives. All are ways in. Again, we can design pretty pictures and talk about things that enable people to begin the change process, and those are good and positive and gets people sort of to the door. selling an end state is somewhat snake oil. There are no fixed systems to learn and apply. If you're selling an ideology and an end state, it's a hard way to practice, and it's not really good practice to do. So getting into the work quickly as a principle, rather than talking conceptually, is part of the challenge of doing this work, which I'm sure many of you can appreciate. That it's, again, as adults, we are in patterns, we have narratives in our head, we are somewhat fixed in our thinking by virtue of age, wisdom, and experience. And it's harder for us to actually step into a new experience for many reasons. The unknown, ambiguity, discomfort, wanting to actually understand what it will be at the end before going through it, which is another anomaly of a change process. So it's disorienting and can be scary and challenging, which then puts a lot of groups and organizations back into where we sit around and we discuss it more than actually doing it. So we let the doing show us what the experience might be, and let it show us how it's actually exciting and interesting and fun and invigorating, which is what I love to put people into, because the moment people experience the difference, then you have the hook, healthy hook, to keep going. So again, attributing to the doing. So then there's the piece about, as I said, I spend a lot of my time teaching meeting structures, designing workshops, designing events, designing planning sessions, designing strategy sessions, teaching decision methodologies, moving people into new technologies to leverage better communication in a system, talking about different ways that groups can come together and team, and the structure of that, or how an organization is structured, and doing change work in those spaces. And it's always interesting there too, because those things are what we ask people to get into and start doing, to be in the experience of. And so there's that barrier to just getting people into those. And then there's a secondary barrier, which is you, as the recipient of that, the doers of those, people have to actually be willing to give up something, and oftentimes a lot of things, because we give up what we know in order to step into these new ways of being and doing. And that's loss, and there's grief that comes with that, and there's emotion that comes with that. And so there's also holding people in that space as we use these processes to move people into the experience of change. I said it's impossible to change without changing. We as change practitioners can show people the structures and the ways of doing new things in new ways. And the reality is that's the first step of just start doing rather than talking. And then it has to be taken by the folks who are actually, it's their change to do, that they have to take it from there. We can't do that part for them. And that's oftentimes something I'm articulating early on with folks, to make sure that they understand that, both as buyers and then, and I'm in a system, there's people who aren't the buyer and they just receive us. But it's, people have to be willing to take it and do it themselves, because I can't actually deliver the change. The change is owned by the group or the team or the organization itself. So then a couple principles out of the article. Experiencing is believing. We've seen time and again that the transition from debating and cognating about change or different methodologies, or is this the right one for us, or is that the right one for us, or does it apply to this organization but it doesn't apply to another organization because we're special. We've seen it all. And the difference between just moving into experience and seeing what adopting simple principles and practices does is worth so much time and money and effort, that it's It's just show, don't tell. Don't wait for permission. I'm in a lot of systems, whether it's leaders in a system or teams in a system, everybody's waiting for someone to give them permission to do change or to be different or to try new things. And the only way to activate change in a system is for someone to start. And that someone can be anywhere in the system. It doesn't have to be a leader. It often doesn't need to be a leader, and sometimes ought not be. So permission is a big conversation we have in terms of getting the doing going as well. Prepare to lose in order to gain. The reality is doing any kind of change work, whether you're a coach, whether you're doing teamwork, whether you're doing systems work, it comes with loss. And that's really important and hugely realistic to understand what we hold in terms of bringing people into change. Because we have to hold the loss in order for people to create the space for people to step into. And that dialectic is always in play. And again, I tend to speak to that directly because that can help minimize whatever anxiety people tend to have around doing change and actually, again, being willing to step in. Mind your ego, I had written about because more that's the monkey mind, the ego monkey mind, that, you know, a lot of the cognating and debating comes from the reptilian brain, the monkey mind, basically feeling threatened. And the loop becomes like, if I just debate it, I avoid, you know, I keep it away, and then the risk is lower. And so that often that coming from a certain part of the brain, the ego, whatever anybody wants to call it. So minding your ego, because there's always the loop of change, you know, it's going to create chaos. It's too much. It's going to disrupt. It's going to be too crazy. And, you know, meanwhile, we've usually are in conversations where things are crazy, and that's why we're in the conversation to begin with. And so risk and the ego and not wanting to actually step in and do are hugely a part of the scenario of doing work as experiential work. Stop planning and start doing. Again, planning is a lot of a cover for delaying action, and we're very conditioned. You know, change management is rooted in a planning process. It's rooted in a linear progression. It's rooted with a beginning and a middle and an end. And so when you come in as change practitioners in 2020, or 2018, probably even 1997, doesn't matter. If you're coming in to do change in this way, you're disrupting an entire framework from which people have been deeply conditioned to think what change looks like. Even like, I'm talking to a group of agile people, like if you think, you know, waterfall to agile and how old that conversation even is, it's still a very new conversation. So same difference with change management. I really come more from the change side of the world than I do from the agile world. So planning is a big one. What are you guys doing? What is the plan for the change? How are you guys going to take us through the change? What are the steps? What are, you know, what outcomes, what deliverables are you delivering? And the answer is, what you're going to find that out. You're going to be the ones showing up to the change and doing the change, and how you show up and do the change is going to be what you deliver to your system about changing it. And so that's a real different type of conversation than what most folks are used to, and what most folks are used to in terms of selling and buying change. I love to do, and I love partnering with and have had amazing partners in my professional life for all these years, and to do this work deeply and in its purest, most authentic form takes being in strong relationships with people, and oftentimes they have a bit of depth to them, and they require a lot of courage to show up as human beings to do this work together. So gratitude and presence are just another huge part of doing this work, and what makes it fun and worthwhile in my humble opinion. So, in conclusion, I'd love to hear some other voices rather than my own right now. The choice is always about braving learning, experiencing oneself differently, both as a practitioner and as the people we bring the change work to. And
She's back. She's back.
That's quick. Good job. Let me unmute you.
I guess, just sorry, can you hear me? Did I get as far as this slide?
Yep, you just popped out for just a second.
Okay, great. It's not up to me. It's up to somebody else when I'm on Zoom and when I'm not here. So yeah, braving learning, experiencing oneself differently, really being in the truth and understanding of how systems work and how change works. And that study in and of itself is highly valuable, which is my background is natural systems and the biology of change. And then using tools and practices and methods to enable those things, not the opposite. And then no tool or method is a panacea. Most are opportunities to with growth and change. And again, that's a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how people think about it. Most of the time it's holding all of those spaces I just talked about. The tools are our helpers and our friends in the process. So that's some background. Now that I've taken 40 minutes to get cut off of Zoom twice and try and talk about what the article was about, I'd love to engage you guys in a conversation with me or with one another, happily with one another as well, to hear sort of what that elicits in your minds, what kind of questions that brings up, what stories you all have to share with one another about delivering change, and the ideas of doing over talking. We have, I think, what, 10 to 20 minutes, Sherry, to chat if people feel like it?
Yep, we have about 10 minutes left to chat. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. I did go ahead and give everybody the ability to unmute yourself. So if you'd like to come on and share your answer, that's fine. I do ask that you take less than 1 minute to say what you are wanting to share. That way we have time for multiple people. Any questions or thoughts about this question? Alrighty, sometimes it takes a minute as people are typing out their questions. So we'll just give
And
it.
it doesn't have to be about that question. That was just a prompt to help. If there's any questions on anything else or
Kathryn, you were talking about Dave Snowden and his work. Do you use tools like SenseMaker to make sense of where an organization is before as part of the work that you do?
I don't, and I don't practice Dave's methodology either, but I love Dave's talking and his writing. But no, I don't do SenseMaker, but also I don't do a lot of that assessment work of a system before I start work. Like I go in, I engage with a particular part of an organization, whether it's a function or a team, or, you know, I come in different ways. And I actually have some tools that we use to quickly get people reflecting on what's in their way, and then get them to sort of self-diagnose into trying new things immediately. So as my practice and the Ready's practice, we don't do assessment is not a part of what we do. So there's no judgment about that tool. That's not part of how we practice.
Okay, actually, I'm looking forward to reading the Ready, so I'll come back to you offline. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. We have two questions. First question is working with engineers that quickly need to turn around projects. They use hackathon as a paradigm to do quick iterations. What is your experience in getting quick iterations for change?
So we, again, funny enough, I'm going to tell you guys about how we practice. So we don't go in, I mean, we could design a workshop. It's not totally true. We could design a workshop that would like get people into such a thing as a hackathon, if it was a very specific workshop. So I think it's a wonderful tool to use if you're trying to teach people how to just think and create and design real fast and ideate, to get into iterating on something. I think that's wonderful. We also go in with large transformation projects and we teach iteration as a way of working. So, which is, it's really easy to say and not as easy to do. If you work with engineers, you know that real well. So like it's getting people to move into that, you know, more agile loop of identifying something, testing it, figuring out what the test and the data is telling you to then move to the next, you know, stage of it is something that we teach teams to do in functions as a way of working. So sometimes we're doing an event type thing, but other times we're actually embedding to teach over the long term how to move a system to actually thinking and working in an iterative way as a way of working.
Interesting. So
quick change is also an anomaly because you know, like if we all knew how to like teach people quick change, we would, you know, probably all be millionaires. I always say that. I'm like, that's how I'm going to become a millionaire. Like there's always these things. So quick change is like, I don't know if there's such a thing, right? But there are constructs and designs and methods and tools that certainly help people to think in tighter frameworks, in tighter timelines, to design and iterate more quickly, to take that data and to put it back in, to keep going, right? To be in that loop of change. So it's more like where my qualitative researcher brain comes from, of, you know, trying to identify things and extract and then put it back in to redesign and do it again. And teaching that as a way of working is not, it's not quick. It takes a lot of discipline, and it takes a lot of attention, and it takes a lot of commitment from a team and an organization to do that.
Yeah, change is definitely not easy. So we have one last question. We might have time for one more after that, but this question is, when doing this change work, what do you do when people are actually unable to execute within the framework that you've set up?
Alejandro, that's I'd almost want to know a little more behind your question. Let me try and take it, but and then if you want to clarify, here's my, I might be shooting incorrectly with your question here, so just hold that lightly. I don't know if it's maturity, because I work with so many different ages and cultures and, you know, genders and ethnicities, and, you know, I work across so many types of humans, to include younger ones. And I often think it's not, if you're running into people not embracing change, oftentimes the question has to go to the practitioners. It has to go to the structures. It has to go to the constructs, because that's part of the artistry and the dance, is figuring out how to find the inroads so that people can make it work for them. And sometimes an agile approach, from what I hear, because I've never delivered one like in that way, but sometimes an agile approach can be too rigid in what you're asking people to do. And that's where people run into, because I run into this in every organization I work in, right? Because I'm very close all the time to people doing agile transformation work in systems. And so oftentimes it's like, it's like, where can you give breathing space for people to actually find their way? Because people need to muck about. It's one of my favorite expressions that is, obviously very academic. People need to muck about in change. They have to find a way, whether it's an individual working with a therapist, an individual going to the gym, an individual, like you can think of all sorts of change as individuals yourself, of like, how do you sort of find your way to like the place where you're in the flow and it can work? You have to do that with groups of people as well. And of course I like small groups. So, because it's mucking about is a thing and it takes time. And you have to allow people to muck about enough to find which of the tools or practices actually resonate. Like, is the retrospective working for a team that's adopting an agile approach, and just focusing on that and letting people get into the rhythm of that so that they feel into that experience and have some success to then add other things.
Awesome. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much for taking a few minutes to answer questions, Kathryn. This was a great presentation.
You're welcome.
Love to hear the information and background that you have as a change agent, not necessarily like as just an agile coach, but how do you do change in organizations? Change is very complex. So definitely appreciate this perspective and appreciate your time here today. So for everyone,
thank you so much.
You are so welcome. And if you would send us your PDF, we'll make those available to everyone after the conference. And we will take a 10-minute break while we switch presentations. And Michael has put the feedback board in the chat if you would like to leave any feedback for any of the presentations today. You can, and as we depart for our 10-minute break, just gonna relaunch this poll so we can get just some quick fun feedback for our presenter, and we will start back up at the top of the hour.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
I'll stop the recording.